So, I want to start this video out with an important question. What do you consider to be mediocre? And I'm not talking about specific shows. I mean, what would you define it as? The Google definition is, of only moderate quality, not very good. For instance, the Google definition of mediocrity is mediocre. See, this is an interesting question because there is no right answer to it, because the concept of something being mediocre is purely subjective because art. But I feel like that kind of thinking will get us nowhere. I'm a strong believer that looking at art through a purely subjective lens is acceptable at times, but in too much of quantity can be toxic to art as a whole. So I want to talk about art in an objectively subjective way. That makes no sense, but at least it enables me to talk about what I really want to talk about today, and that is the show Death March to the Parallel World Rhapsody. So let's immediately abuse the new rule I set into place and say that this show is objectively mediocre. The show is an orgy of washed up tropes, generic characters, underwhelming art, and rehashed narratives. It may just be the least creative show of the year. I feel like this show was written by a group of producers sitting at a round table doing international surveys before approving every single creative decision. The show really feels like an empty husk of an anime. I feel like this show is just soulless, yet it's the 6th most popular show of the season, beating out After the Rain, Takagi-san, Yuru Camp, and yes, even A Place Further Than a Universe. This is unexpected. I personally have been keeping up with this show because I find it off-putting in a way that's clearly unintended. I enjoy shows that make me feel some emotion, and while watching this show, it evokes a feeling of unease for me. That's clearly not the author's intent, but it's enough to keep me watching the show weekly and seeing where it ends up. So, after making this crazy revelation about the show, I had to face a weird fact. Death March to a Parallel World Rhapsody is a successful show. It clearly seems to be popular and doing well in a season that is honestly pretty strong show-wise. So, why, and more importantly, how? So let's begin with the show itself. The show begins with Sato. I think that's his name. It says Suzuki on Mal, but I think he goes by Sato. Sato is a game designer who is teleported into a game he was creating. He accidentally starts with some overpowered spells and destroys an entire army and becomes insanely strong in about 5 minutes. Like, his level is 300 and some of the strongest people we've met so far are like level 30, just for reference purposes. Sato is your generic Kirito self-insert character. He's overpowered, rich, kind to everyone, but fierce when he needs to be. Oh yeah, and he thinks slavery is a bad institution, but still partakes in it. Real talk, I think it's interesting that he literally owns multiple slaves and has yet to set them free because he just kind of assumes that he treats them well enough. Come on dude, please stop owning slaves. It's still bad no matter how nice you are to them. Either way, I feel like Sato is comparable to a piece of white bread, tasteless and boring. He shows zero signs of developing any as a character or learning something new about the world because obviously he knows best and no one would ever dare challenge his opinions. Let's just move on because that's literally it. After that, you have generic love interests 1 and slaves 2 through 6. Each one has a fixated personality and are about as creative as you would imagine. It's incredibly hard to get invested in any of these characters because can you even call these things characters? I feel like they should just be standing in the background somewhere while a more interesting Sato walks in the foreground. After that, some events happen in the city, but there's no real suspense because everything is mere ants when it comes to strength differences between Sato and the world. There's no stakes at all, but the show tries to pretend like there are some. For instance, in the most recent arc, a Grim Reaper-looking character comes and kidnaps the newest lolly being inducted into the gang. And right after he teleports, Sato just follows him, showing that Sato could definitely catch this guy and then crush him. Yet he just accepts to do some monotonous challenge for him in exchange for the girl, and it's just obvious that Sato will have no problem with this. It's not filler, it's relevant to the plot, but it really feels like a giant waste. I couldn't care less because there's just no danger at all. So I've been shit-talking this show for quite some time now, but what difference does it make? It's clear that Death March to the Parallel World Rhapsody is successful, and I think I've figured out why. You see, most shows that are this bad have something in them that's a deal breaker for most. Look no further than Black Clover. Ironically enough, I consider Black Clover to be at least a little more creative than this show, although not by much. But Black Clover has Asta. This was a terrible creative decision and was a major deal breaker for most people who were watching the show. Death March to the Parallel World Rhapsody doesn't have this, at least not yet. The show has not taken a single creative risk, which honestly may be for the better. There's no annoying yelling character, no unnecessary over-the-top lolly fan service, and no rapey scenes. The show was clearly written to avoid any deal breakers like that. Thus, I'm still current with the show, and I would imagine that most people who started it are the same. I don't approve of what Death March to the Parallel World Rhapsody stands for. I think if you're going to reuse generic tropes like this show did, you really need to show an extreme mastery of them. I think my favorite example of this would have to be Death Parade. Death Parade is a show that isn't incredibly unique. It definitely tried a few new things, but it heavily relied on its contemporaries. But the show itself explores its own mastery of storytelling. Its success isn't through its uniqueness, but through the fact that it does what everyone else is doing, but much, much better. Death March to the Parallel Rhapsody doesn't. It does just enough to get by and to keep its audience from dropping the show. The show's success is grounded due to its mediocrity and the ability to avoid any and all deal breakers. Taking risk is part of the creative process, but then again, to see a show avoid any such risk this masterfully is kind of impressive in itself. Thank you guys so much for watching. Also, I've been experimenting with this new end card thing for about 2 months now, and you guys seem to like it, so I think it's officially going to be a permanent change to the channel. It's a good spot to interact with you guys, and I think I have a few other ideas I want to try out, one of them being a Q&A later on. But if you guys have any other ideas I can do for these end segments, please leave them in the comments down below. A huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys are my heroes. If you're interested in seeing how I edit, chatting with me, or just supporting the channel, I run a $1 a month Patreon to make that as easy as possible. Make sure you guys share, like, comment, and subscribe. This is Manime Matt. Make sure you guys say, man, go watch that goddamn anime!